I have the ball for the next semester, and then Dr. Peter Feldmeyer is going to take over, and he's also speaking in this part of the series. So this whole thing is designed to deal with religion and public life. We have some really good speakers coming. Some people know Tom Reese as editor of America Magazine, and Carol Keehan, one of the braver souls walking the earth, and she will be here. And WGTE is doing the taping of some of the lectures, not all, a couple of them, 3 of or 4 of them anyway, and then they're available on Knowledge Stream when they get their work all done. So the handout has a lot of the material that I'm going to use, although it might get packaged a little bit differently since I finished that at 1 o'clock this afternoon and have rethought the whole thing since then. So might get repackaged a bit. But anyway, I'm talking about essentially the virtue of solidarity. And I'm talking about it in the context of what we call globalization, which has produced a counter movement which we might call the new tribalism. So that's what I'm about, virtue of solidarity and context of globalization and the new tribalism that's part of our culture today. I want to locate virtue. You know, I mean, virtues develop and change. I mean, you're not going to find solidarity in the list of virtues in Aquinas, at least not directly. Am I, Peter? No. Good. That's what I thought. So the idea of virtue, and virtue's got to be like context specific. I mean, when they did missions in the past in Catholic parishes back in the 40s and 50s, when a certain number of people had big drinking problems, temperance was the big virtue. We got to have temperance, you know. So you have to find virtues that fit the situation. So I'm suggesting that solidarity is one of a virtue that fits our modern contemporary world. That's what I'm about. So I want to do a brief bit on globalization. You know, there's an interesting thing in the notes here which you might look at. It's under B, right in early on there. But anyway, the one author took you know, we got about 6.5 billion people or more in the world, and if you proportionally reduce it down to 100, you got 100 people in the world, in a village, say. So then the question is, well, how would they sort out? So you can see there, in that village of 100, 60 of them are Asian, 14 African, 14 North and South American. 33 are Christians, 20 are Muslim. That's why I often quote that thing that Christians and Muslims today are over half the population in the world. You know, and then a lot of people are hungry, as you see. 30 suffer from malnutrition. I suppose one of the striking thing, only 2 would have college degrees out of those 100 in the village. You know, about 2/3 of them live in below the poverty line. And striking one, the one richest man of the 100 would have as much wealth as the poorest 57 taken together. So that's a way of trying to get a picture of this globe in which we live, this kind of situation where we find ourselves. I think it's 40% of the people in the world have never made a telephone call. So that we get that sense of what this global village looks like. Well, so globalization is a process that's been going on. I mean, some link it way back into Babylonian times, but it made more sense to me to say that it began with the Age of Discovery in 1492. I got that from Bob Schreiter, a whole lot of this early materials from him, fine writer and good theologian. That, you know, that's when we started to come together. So Europeans came and met up with Native Americans, much to the Native Americans' distress and troubles. But now the globe begins to come together. People are, I think of Matteo Ricci going into China and encountering the Chinese culture. So the globe begins to shrink in various ways. And then there's, Schreider divides it up into the period after World War I, 1945 to 1989, when the Soviet Union dissolved and the Berlin Wall came down. And that whole period is dominated by the Cold War. And I remember language and talk saying, well, that'll never end. We're going to be under the Soviet threat forever. And suddenly it was gone. And we entered into some new kind of relation to them. Well, since then, globalization has sort of taken off. And the one constant you find in all the people who analyze this is that there's a new interconnectedness, a hyper-connectivity, some would call it. There's all kinds of opinions about what globalization means, whether it's good or bad, and there's no common definition agreed upon, but everyone sees we're connected in, like we haven't been before. We're connected in with the internet, instant communication around the country. You can watch the Olympic Games. People are watching the World Cup together. We can watch on television and know that the Syrian ambassador to the United States is lying when he describes the situation in Damascus and in Syria. We can see it on the television. The government forces brutalizing their own people. We will see those horrible images of children starving in Sudan. All of that is available to us as it was not available in the past. So a big part of one important dimension of globalization is the technology, the information technology, the quick access, and so on. Then there's always in the forefront of this is the economic side of it, so that capital can move easily. We're very aware of the results of that in our own area. So many manufacturing jobs have left the United States, gone elsewhere. Capital will take their manufacturing to where they make money. And they get cheaper labor, so it's not surprising we lose so many jobs. And so economic considerations become really important in all of this. And then there's also the political side of it, when you begin to wonder how do we regulate things, and most people would say, well, the political aspect of globalization hasn't kept up with the economic very well, and we need structures to care. We have the World Bank, and we take war criminals accused of war crimes to The Hague and try them there. So it's an example of sort of political type institutions that are at work in our world. And then there's the cultural dimension. Images come to my mind of a gigantic McDonald's on Pushkin Square in Moscow with lines a couple blocks long feeding into the various entrances to the McDonald's. Image of in Japan of people, young women who grew up Shinto and are going to die Buddhist, having Christian weddings, having the Marino priest marry them in white gowns, very totally Western kind of thing. Very sought after. This priest could be busy all day long having weddings in Japan, and some of them do. They have no connection with Christianity, but they want that Western thing. So somebody has talked about this new world as McWorld, where McDonald takes over, and we export our movies and our magazines, our television programs, our styles. A whole youth culture is created. As you could say that young people in Latin America who have access to the internet often have values closer to the young people in the United States than they do to their own parents in a Latin American country. So it gives you some feel of how that works the cultural dimension of globalization. You can also talk about the ecological dimension, in which the rapid industrialization in China, for example, and elsewhere, how that has created more pollution in our world. Well, that's one way of thinking about what this globalization is all about. Greater connectedness all around in various dimensions that we have. Now, when we begin to look at that and analyze that, even from a secular viewpoint, you could say, well, that internet thing is wonderful. You can have access to information from all over the world, from libraries, different sources. People can be in touch with one another. We saw how important that was in the revolution in Egypt. So many young people were involved, connected by cell phones, so that in this world the oppressor is more exposed. In the world of the internet, it's harder to maintain hierarchical structures because everybody is open to information and people can share ideas. You can have a whole revolution going on through the internet. A whole way of making changes as a result of people interacting. So it democratizes the whole situation in many ways. It makes it harder for authoritarians to just impose their will. More and more people could see what the grievances are and so on. So, and you could think of what the economics has done for a place like China. I remember in the Guangzhou area, you'd have an economic enterprise zone and supermarkets that look just like supermarkets in the United States. All kind of goods available. All kind of people in China who've made it now and are millionaires and so on. And India has done so well. And all part of this globalization. Many people have been raised up out of poverty as a result. But at the same time, you have all of the negativity connected with globalization. I want to read something to you from Pope. I'm going to wait with that. Not going to read it now. Right, I'm not going to read it at all. Where was I? Yeah, a negative critique of globalization. Right? The inequities. Africa's been left behind. Many of the liberation theologians from Latin America and Asia and Africa say how globalization is a terrible thing. It's hurt us. We're left behind. It's smothered our own cultures. All the consumerism that's connected with our movies and books and magazines and TV programs that we export around the world are somehow diminishing local cultures, that a world culture is being created that sort of subverts the values that people have in their own local culture, that it's all connected with consumerism, with having more goods, of having a better life, creates all kind of dissatisfaction in the developing world when they see how we live, all the violence we export, movies and television and so on, has a deleterious effect on local cultures and so on. So you can see that those negative things that are happening as well. Pointed out the pollution that occurs as a result of rapid industry. I remember being in Guangzhou in China, and I often say this, but I saw this phalanx of bicycles in this very wide street, and it suddenly came to me like, what if all those people had a car? It was like I was overwhelmed with that. What if they had a car? We wouldn't be able to breathe. The pollution, if all those people had a car. Well, more of them are getting cars now. GM's selling a lot of cars in China and so on. But there's a whole ecological problem that results in all of this. So you could say that globalization is a mixed bag, done some good things, some bad things, and it's important to sort all of that out in various ways. Now, one of the main things to me that's happened as a result of globalization is the opposite movement that Václav Havel called the new tribalism. Ever since I heard him say that, I have latched onto that term, and it speaks well to me of many things. Havel became the first president of the Czech Republic, a playwright, poetic kind of guy, and so on. He was taken with the fact that the Slovaks wanted to split from the Czechs. They'd been together in one country, Czechoslovakia, but now the Slovaks didn't want that. They wanted to have their own thing. So Havel, it's part of what influenced Havel to say there's a new tribalism afoot. So in many ways, the globalized world has set that in motion. In the globalized world, there's so much unsettlement. There's so much chaos. There's so much complex change going on, so much social mobility, that it seems in part to have produced a sense that I got to be rooted someplace. I got to know who I am. I got to be in my own tribe. So we see that happening in many ways. I remember talking to chaplains who attended to Vietnam vets in hospitals, and how that they would be there for long periods of time with those vets, and the vets would not talk to them about Vietnam, even though they were close to them. They would only talk to other veterans. And how often people are divorced, want to be in a support group with other divorced people because they understand what's going on. We all live these busy, complex lives, and we got time to ourselves. Most of us don't want to be in a fight with people who think different from ourselves. We want to be with somebody who understands, somebody we're close to, and so on. For so many people with addictive problems, the 12-step programs are really where their spirituality is. They will say that. That's my spirituality. That's and they feel free to talk in that group where they wouldn't talk in another kind of setting. So we see so many ways this new tribalism playing itself. There's an interesting book by Bill Bishop, a journalist, called The Big Sort, S-O-R-T. And his thesis is that in the United States today, we sort ourselves out into groupings of like-minded people. He studied it geographically. People move to certain places. And people in that place, they move to places where there's people like them. And so you get gated communities where people have pretty much the same economic status and so on. And so geographically, we tend to come together like that. And then there's the whole thing of the internet and the blogosphere. I remember a theologian was roundly attacked by, it was Rick Gallardi, roundly attacked by a faculty member here at the University of Toledo. And the response, it was a really harsh attack. And the response, Rick confronted him directly and wanted to talk about it. And the guy says, his defense was, well, on my blogs, it's a lot worse than what I said. What I said is not, in other words, he feels moderate because on his blog, the extreme comes to the fore. And that's what happens in all these things, It's like-minded people, it's the extremes that are heard, and so on. So we begin to get that sort of thing. I think it was Pauline Kael, the movie critic, who, when Nixon was elected, said, "I can't understand it. I don't know anybody who voted for him." And it's now the same thing. not just a movie critic, but most of us, you know, probably could say the same thing. How did he get elected? None of my friends voted for him. No one I know voted for him, which is a clear statement of, you know, of the big sort. You know, and so we hang out with people who think like we do. We read the magazines that our group reads. We watch the news that our group reads. And we all, through that process in the new tribalism, become more and more isolated, more and more private. We even get the same thing in the church. You know, it used to be that parishes were the place where you could interact with people who were different. Everyone in this geographic area, well, you'd have, you know, the Democrats, Republicans, Independents. You'd have liberals and conservatives. But now today, even that's breaking down. Because people go where they want to go. And parishes are known for being like this. And I like that, so that's where I go. So even a place where was probably one of the last bastions of actual diversity and interaction, where one had to negotiate with people who were different, is gone. Now, we have Kathy Caveney coming here, and there's an article in America, you know, can we talk about abortion? Most people find they can't talk about abortion. Can't talk about it because my circle of friends all think this way. You know, have I ever talked to somebody on the other side of where I'm at on the abortion question? Very little of that goes on. Very little. It almost becomes scary because we're not used to it, not used to the bite of that and so on. So all of that by way of the sort of new tribalism that we have in the world. I think a partial reaction to globalization. And, well, you know, the critique of that is, as I've been suggesting by the way I presented it, is that it's narrowing. It's constricting. We begin to live in one little world where we pat each other on the back and say we're terrific. No, where we don't have to negotiate, where we don't have the input from the other side, where we don't have to respond to other people, and we become isolated and more opinionated and more one-sided in our views. I think that's the negative critique. Now, the positive critique of the tribalism is that the global culture can't give us a feeling of belonging. And we don't belong in that sense, you know, the global world. You know, and it doesn't supply meaning for us or purpose. We usually get our meaning, purpose, identity in the smaller group. You know, where we interact with people and where we get feedback as to who we are. Our identity is clearly social. We know who we are in large part by what is fed back to us in life. It's a social identity, you know. So the small groups are important. I mean, I applaud the 12-step programs and the spirituality that's there. You know, it's wonderful if people have a support group where they can go, and divorced people can talk to one another, people with unemployed can talk to one another, where veterans can talk to one another. We need that, and that's where we get solidity, we get rootedness, and we find a meaning, and we get sort of our moral sense out of that situation. So we need our own tribe, you know, we need our tribe, and so on. For all of those absolutely essential things. But the danger then, of course, is that it's isolating and we don't learn how to live in this larger global world. Well, that is my frame for talking about the virtue of solidarity. So solidarity is, more modern thought. I just remind you, virtues are a great way to think about the Christian life. That's what St. Thomas Aquinas did. He built his whole moral theology on the virtues, which he took in large part from Aristotle. And so the whole of his moral theology of how you live is based on the 7 virtues, the 3 theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, and the cardinal virtues of prudence and temperance and justice and fortitude. So part of it is, to find out what virtue fits. Like if I'm giving a talk to a group of Marine Corps veterans, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense for me to emphasize the virtue of fortitude. Probably not what these brave people need to hear. So we always have to find out what virtue is it that we need to hear. And I'm suggesting in a globalized, tribalized world that solidarity is that virtue. Now, virtues, as Aquinas taught us, are acquired habits. They are like a second nature, he said. They become part of us so that we see things in a habitual way and we act pretty easily and do the right thing because we're now sort of, I don't want to use this word too carefully, but we're now programmed in a way. So if we put on the mind of Christ, then we tend to see the world through the eyes of Christ. So habits and virtues are really great, and a lot of moral theology today is done out of analysis of virtues, and that's again part of the setting for solidarity. Aristotle said another important thing. He said, if you want to know what justice is, don't theorize about it. Find a just person and watch what they do. So that's what I want to do. I want to find some people with the virtue of solidarity and watch them. See how they act. That's how we would learn what solidarity is about. Now, the first person that I want to raise up is Pope John Paul II. So those who have bias here, put it aside and stay open. Stay open. So John Paul is probably the first pope who understood what globalization was all about. He understood the power of the media. He understood the importance of symbol and image. So we have these images of him going to over 120 countries. And what does he do when he gets off the plane? Kneels down and kisses the tarmac. He understood that that's a gesture that would speak to the people there. He knew so many languages and could speak the languages and would do that. And what an affirmation that is to a people to have the Pope come and speak their own language and so on. So he understood this, and he understood that he's the one that gave us the language of solidarity as a virtue. Now, popes before that talked about solidarity, especially Pope Paul VI said, in the modern world we needed a spirit of solidarity. It was seen as like a directive or a principle or a guideline. But Pope John Paul II began in 1987 to talk about it as a virtue, and a virtue that was needed in the globalized world. And he understood that it was a Christian virtue, and he rooted it in his own understanding of human nature. One of the strongest parts, he wrote his doctoral dissertation on what we call theological anthropology or philosophical anthropology, that looking at what is true about us humans. That he was strong in that. The book, it's translated as the acting person. And he understood that solidarity is rooted in an anthropology. That is, who are we and what are we all about? And so he saw us, we have a common origin from God, a common destiny to return to God, that we're all made in the image and likeness of God. that we all have one spirit in us that unites us together. In other words, the deepest reality about us humans is we're not individuals trying to figure out how to join the group. No, we are already social. We're already interdependent. We're thrown into human relationships, find ourselves in a family, have to deal with friends and colleagues and so on. We're essentially social, interdependent people. We're a member of the whole human family. So he understood that that is crucial to developing this virtue of solidarity. And he also understood that the Bible could help us in all of this. He was very good at saying that Christ is the fulfillment of the human. Christ shows us what it means to be truly alive. I love that Irenaeus. The glory of God is the human person fully alive. And that Christ represents that. Christ shows us that. So his Christology is an important part of how he sees all this. They're all members of the mystical body of Christ. That Christ lived in solidarity with the people of his own time, especially outcasts and marginalized. That we talk about Christ as the risen Lord, who's Lord of the whole cosmos, the material world, and also Lord of the whole human family. So that he gave us a solid theological rooting for this virtue of solidarity. And he understood that to have the virtue of solidarity meant that you would, on a consistent basis and in a persevering way, work for the common good. That's what characterizes this virtue, that one has a sense of the common good and is willing to work to serve that. That one puts aside at times self-interest in order to attend to the good of the larger whole. So it's connected in with the common good in the Pope's mind. So the Pope was able to touch in. He was in Latin America. I'm not going to remember all the ceremonies, but he gave this talk to the priests or bishops or theologians, and he was very critical of liberation theology, as we know. Very critical. And I think it was the next day, he goes out and he's talking to 500,000 people, poor peasant-type people, and he connects in with them, this charismatic figure. You know, they sense that somehow that he's on their side. They didn't like that liberation theology, but at some gut level, some visceral level, these people thought he's with us. He's in solidarity with us. So the Pope was able to do that in many different situations. So he travels all over the world and he embraces and so on. And he stands as my first sort of model of what part of what solidarity would look like. For him, it's rooted in the Christian tradition, biblical tradition, the whole idea of Jesus identifying himself with the poor, that we all live in as part of the human family, all the wonderful biblical stuff that is communal. All of it's communal. The whole biblical thing is we're saved as a member of a people. We're called upon to love one another, even our enemies. It's all there. All right, that's my first one. My second one is less well known, but I think saw something important the Pope didn't see. And that is a young woman by the name of Jessica Kelly, who was president of our Catholic Student Association here. And less well known than John Paul II. Jessica grew up in a Catholic family, and she had a great sense of serving others. She went for about every week through the first 3 years or so to the Josina Lot place where she took care of disabled people, challenged people, and so on. She did that regularly. And when we had Habitat for Humanity trip, Jessica goes down into the Gulf area and helps people build houses and so on. She's very attuned to that. She came to us that way. She was part of our Christian leadership program, was very active in the Catholic Student Association, became president, and she won the Jefferson Award. And the university gave her that award. Then she got a national, went to Washington to receive an award for all that. Jessica writes about her own experiences with all of that. She sort of, but the key experience for her was when she went to Jamaica. And she went to Jamaica as part of a medical mission team and interacted with poor Jamaicans. For Jessica, that was life-changing. That was a conversion. And she began to see the world in another way. She developed in a deeper way the virtue of solidarity. And she says she was a changed person as a result of all of that. And what she found out is that she could learn from those people. And she was so taken with the fact that those people that she interacted had almost nothing. They lived in these terrible hovels and so on. And yet they had a peacefulness about them and a happiness. I think she sort of recognized how in our own country how much depression is created by affluence and wanting more and so on. I think she's had insight into that. Jessica's wonderful, beautiful young woman every way. Consciousness was changed. So I said that she was good at something the Pope wasn't good at. The Pope was good at going and teaching people and encouraging them. He wasn't too good at listening. He wasn't too good at learning from others. And solidarity has to have that. So the virtue of solidarity means that we are open to what the other has to say, that we're willing to enter into dialogue with the other and have our own outlook enriched. It's like John Donne says, we need to pass over to other people's viewpoint, and then when we come back always to our own viewpoint, if we've really crawled behind their eyes, if we've really listened well, we come back enriched. So solidarity, the virtue, full virtue, is premised on dialogue and openness and learning as well as teaching, receiving as well as giving, which for me, Jessica represents in a very real way. That's my second. So what are we doing? Looking at what solidarity looks like in real people. What the virtue. I know what solidarity is? Well, learn from Jessica. Where would that take you? Well, at Corpus Christi, we put a lot of emphasis these days on Christian service programs, and face-to-face interaction. I mean, it makes a difference if we make pizzas here and send them down to the distribution center, or whether people go down with the pizzas and give them to people and meet the poor people who are getting them. Makes a difference if they go down with the Cherry Street Mission people and talk to them, meet them, see them face to face. That's what Jessica reminded you. Great importance in solidarity of personal encounter. How do you break out of the tribalism where we don't know how anybody else in the world lives except us and our little circle? Well, that's one way. In our country, to interact with those who are poor, meet them, talk to them, get to know them. That's how we broke through in the ecumenical world. We used to have the living room dialogues where Catholics went to Protestant homes and vice versa and actually sat down and talked to one. So, oh, wow. Really? You had that scripture reading on Sunday? So did we. How did that happen? What a coincidence. Oh, maybe it wasn't a coincidence. Oh, you got a lectionary like we do. Wow. Good. It's that face-to-face thing that is the only way to overcome the new tribalism, I think, when you get down to it. My next is a couple, and that's Bill and Melinda Gates as my models of solidarity. So remember Bill Gates' story, dropped out of Harvard before he finished. Must have been smart to get in, I guess. But he got out and found Microsoft, and eventually sells it off and becomes a billionaire, and 10 years later he's the richest guy in the world. How does he make his money? Globalization, in part. Internet stuff, software, all that stuff that's part of that dimension of globalization. So he participates in that world, made a lot of money like a lot of other people do in the world, as being part of that, part of the globalization process. So he marries Melinda. Melinda grew up in a devout Catholic family, went to Catholic grade school and Catholic high school. I think she took into her very being a whole lot of what Catholic social thought is all about. Well, anyway, as they go along, they decide to found in 1999, this foundation becomes the biggest endowment foundation in the whole country, I guess in the whole world. And what they do is they try to figure out how can we best use this great financial gift we have. When Bill Gates' mother was dying, she told him, you remember, you've been blessed, and you've received so much you have to give back. That was a part of the message of the mother to the son. You have to do that. Part of his motivation, I think, in doing that. But they figure out, root problems and how you're going to fix them. They did so well that when Warren Buffett figured out, what am I going to do with all my money? I got to give it away. Remember, he got 60 other people to sign up with him, billionaires, that are going to give away a good percentage of their money before they die. I mean, this guy's serious. What does he do? I'm not going to start my own foundation. These people figured it out. I'm going to give my money to them. So he becomes part of the Gates Foundation. Now they're able to help people, and they were very taken with people in Africa and the AIDS problem. And they say people got to have health to begin with, and they need opportunity. So that's the kind of thing they're going to foster. Part of that whole thing, Melinda was very much in favor of contraceptive use for that problem in Africa. I noticed that Pope Benedict has begun to catch up with her in a way, on showing some openness to that particular insight of Melinda Gates. Good to stay open and learn as you go along. So they're doing this good stuff. And they're doing it out of this sense that we're connected in the rest of the world. When other people are suffering, we're suffering. We got an obligation to make it better. So what do I get? What's my point with that? Why did I raise them up? Because solidarity has to be intelligent. In moral theology, we've always said that prudence is the main virtue, cardinal virtue. It's the most important one. It drives everything. It tells you how to be. Tells people with a drinking problem, don't drink. Be prudent. Don't spend all night at a bar. Or our young people who want to save sex for marriage, don't sleep together. Prudence. So prudence informs solidarity. Prudence and intelligence. So these people use their head to figure out how to help the human family. To do good. And they have resources to do that and so on. Well, what would we get out of that? Well, if we're going to try to develop this virtue of solidarity ourselves, we've got to use our heads. It might mean that people try to invest their money in companies that have a greater social consciousness. There's a movement along that line. That some people look at the sort of life simplicity movement and say I could have a more simple lifestyle and then I could help other people. Maybe it means investigating a bit the many requests we get for money and actually thinking through where it would best be used and how we could help people the most. So there might be simple ways of following the Gates model here of solidarity, prudence connected with that great virtue. Let me try another one, and this is familiar, and John Shea says you keep repeating the same story until you get it right. So people have heard me say this many times, but the other figure I raise up is Dorothy Day. And she's back there facing the baptismal font, founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, surely one of the great figures in the whole history of American Catholicism. David O'Brien says she's the most influential and interesting figure in the whole history of Catholicism in the United States. Well, you know, Dorothy Day met Peter Maurin, and he taught her Catholic social teaching. She became aware of that. She had sort of a Marxist background and so on, and grew up without religion and all of that. You know, and Peter Maurin taught her the importance of the whole Catholic tradition of social teaching, and she drank that in many ways. But what she did, of course, was found a hospitality house, and she lived there with the poor. We have all these stories about her, you know, taking care of incontinent men and sleeping in the same room with women who were, you know, out of it or drunk or whatever. And she talks about the smelly bodies of the unwashed and having to interact with them. And that was a cross for her in many ways, but a cross that she bore. And then, of course, people know where I'm going. It's the Robert Coles story. You know, Robert Coles, a psychologist. He was a medical student and taking classes at Union Theological, and he finished some exams, and he gets on subway, goes down into lower Manhattan where Dorothy Day is, and just has an impulse to go in and meet her. He didn't even know her, just an impulse. So he goes in, walks in the Catholic Worker House, and there's two ladies sitting over there, dressed about the same. And one of them is obviously drunk and yelling and out of it. The other one is Dorothy Day. So he waits, and they're talking, and they're going on and on. And he's getting very impatient. And finally, the lady stops yelling for a while, and Dorothy Day gets up and walks over to him and says, "Are you waiting to see one of us?" Robert Coles wrote a whole biography of Dorothy Day off of that. Are you waiting to see one of us? You want to know what solidarity feels like and looks like? Solidarity to the poor. Are you waiting to see one of us? That's just so overwhelming. Robert Coles never got over it, wrote a whole biography about it. It was in the touchstones. So you want to know what solidarity looks like in terms of Dorothy Day, it is that sense of hands-on, of personal interaction, I suppose of getting our hands dirty, of feeling from one's heart that I'm part of the human family. Dorothy Day would have never said, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." To never say that. Remember the time that somebody gave her an expensive ring? And the first poor lady who came in, very expensive ring, and she gave her the ring. And the people at the Catholic Worker House said, "Oh, why did you do that? We could have sold that, and we could have had all this money and helped so many people." He says, "What makes you think that woman doesn't have a right to have something beautiful?" Oh, that's the sense that we get of what solidarity might be all about. Dorothy Day's sense of solidarity then expanded beyond that. You know, she was so interested in women's rights and unions' rights. She was very big, took on the Cardinal Spellman over the organization of the grave diggers, right to unionize. And yet, after that big fight with Cardinal Spellman, Dorothy Day said, "Yes, I can go to Mass with him celebrating and go to communion and feel perfectly fine with it." So she was in solidarity not only with those poor people, not only with the union, the grave diggers, but with this cardinal as well. Let me try another familiar figure, and this would be Martin Luther King. Obviously, we got him back there too, facing the baptism font, witnesses to what baptism is all about. So, I mean, Martin Luther King's story is, pretty well known, and of course, he had his own tribe. The tribe, the African Americans. He was the pastor of a black parish. And he attended those people. He grew up in a black Baptist environment. He sang those hymns. He knew that world. The cadence in his language and his speeches all reflect that world. That was his world. That was his tribe. And then he went forward and gave that first grade talk in the Montgomery bus boycott, where he said that with only about 15 minutes to prepare, and where he says that our cause is not right only if you think the Constitution is wrong and Jesus was nothing but a utopian dreamer. And he kept that dialectic throughout all of his time. In other words, he spoke a secular language that people could understand, the American dream. He went back to it constantly. And he combined it with the Christian message. And that gave him this sense of solidarity with secular people as well as religious people. But then the crucial time came. He was so successful with the boycotts and everything, and Lyndon Johnson, his great friend, they passed the civil rights legislation in '64, voting rights in '65. He's on a roll. He's got the most powerful person in the world on his side. And what does he do? He comes out publicly against the Vietnam War. Johnson was furious. It broke their relationship. He gave up this closeness with the most powerful man in the world who could help his cause. He said that I have to have concern not only for my fellow citizens here in this country, but for Asian peasants as well. So what did he do? He had a circle of solidarity that included his own people, but it included the oppressor as well. As he said over and over, these Jim Crow laws, this segregation hurts the oppressor as much as the oppressed. So he had solidarity with them. And it took the utmost courage, and things went badly for him after that, to expand that sense into the global common good, where he included now Asiatic peasants, people in Vietnam who were suffering from the war there. What do we get out of that? Well, what's the point of all of that? Well, part of the point is that we have to look at how narrow our circle of solidarity is and where could it be expanded? Who isn't within my circle of solidarity? Who is outside of it? Who won't I listen to? Who do I exclude? And how would I expand that circle? And it also brings up, in our world today, a globalized, tribalized world, how it often takes courage, fortitude, the virtue of fortitude, in order to be in solidarity with others. It often is at a price, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer got. There's a cost to discipleship, a cost that one has to be ready to pay in order to develop this virtue of solidarity. And could have a lot more figures. I'll try one more. And that's Cardinal Joseph Bernardin of Archbishop of Chicago, was in Cincinnati and so on. I mean, Bernardin's story is really a story of conversion. He wasn't doing all that well down in Cincinnati. He was overweight. He wasn't praying too much, neglecting his spiritual life by his own admission. I happen to know priests who interacted with him at that time. and really called him to task. And they helped him. They were in solidarity with their bishop, which was a beautiful thing. They spoke truth to power and helped the cardinal get his own spiritual life back together. And in Chicago, he spent an hour every morning in prayer. And every day that he was in Chicago, this busy, busy man visited his ailing, aging mother. Visited her all the time. So he had that solidarity theme at work in his own life. And then, as you know, in the last years of his life, he became concerned about tribalism within the Catholic Church itself. Not with Muslims in the world, not all this other stuff, but tribalism within his own Catholic world. The polarization in the Catholic Church, and it hurt him deeply. And he gave his last 4 years of his life to that cause. He called it the Common Ground Initiative. Eventually he issued a document called To Be Catholic, in which he said, we can't have this. We have to overcome this. No, we have to enter into dialogue with one another. We can't demonize one another. And when you enter into dialogue, he said, you have to take the other person not at their worst. You know, the dumbest thing you ever said is this, and keep pinning them down to that. But to take others at their best. You know, and don't come at it as saying, I'm in the light, I've got the truth, and the rest of you people are out of it. The rest of you people are the bad guys. He said you can't do that. We have to have genuine dialogue. And he said that dialogue has to be rooted in the fact that Christ is the center point for all of us. Christ is the norm and guide for all of us in this Catholic community of ours. And that we're all subject to this long Catholic tradition that we're called upon to take seriously. That's what brings us together is the Eucharist. He said the Eucharist cannot be a battleground. The Eucharist has to be the center of our common ground. And we have to bring that together. You have to join around the table. He had a great sense of prayer in relation to his solidarity. And you know, he went through that whole thing of the being falsely accused of sex abuse and so on. So when the young man finally said, I made it all up, I did nothing to this and so on, what did Bernardine do? Flew down to where the guy was and celebrated with him the Eucharist. The Eucharist. That table of solidarity, that the banquet that brings us together. So that was part of in his bones and blood. And he died, you know, and again, he suffered so much from what the other bishops, cardinals said about him and so on. Such a hard thing for him to deal with. And yet he retained a love and care for them as well, despite their severe criticisms of him. So I raised up Cardinal Bernardine again as a figure that lives out the virtue of solidarity. And what do I get out of that? The solidarity's got to do with prayer, with being in tune with the great God, and a prayer life that then has a horizontal dimension to it, that brings us to love of neighbor. And the great importance of the Eucharist is bringing us together and being the great sign of our solidarity and the great cause of our solidarity. So Bernardine puts a spiritual twist on this thing, a spiritual grounding that is absolutely crucial for this virtue of solidarity. So, look at those figures. You know, we live in a globalized, tribalized world, and you want to know what solidarity looks like? Instead of a definition, instead of an abstract understanding of it, if you want that, read my notes. You know. But instead, people, flesh and blood, you know, individuals who in one way or another embodied that, whether a pope, or Jessica Kelly in our midst, or famous people, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, the Gates, you know, and Cardinal Bernardine. So we raise them up for our consideration to see what the virtue might look like. Well, I'm going to stop. exactly on time, thus modeling for the rest of the lecture series. Let's take a stand-up break.
Laissez-faire capitalism. And in a lecture yesterday, the Islamic chair, Dr. Anjum, had mentioned that in his visit to Egypt, the new government in Egypt had rejected IMF and World Bank funding. And obviously it appears that the Egyptian, well, there's this notion, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that, that whatever this model of global solidarity is that we're offering to the world, what it is not, and precisely if it is not merely free trade and merely laissez-faire capitalism, and I'm wondering if you might speak to that.
Yeah, very good point. I'm reminded of something that Gustavo Gutierrez, liberation theologian, said: rejecting globalization is like rejecting electricity. It's there, It's a phenomenon that's going on. The internet's there. You can't stop it or do something else about it. But what some like to think is that you can direct it. That there's ways in which people who have a sense of solidarity, and Christian people where God the gospel can somehow humanize the whole thing. I said I was going to read a quote from Pope John Paul II, and then I said I wasn't. Let me see here. Here's one of his critiques of globalization. And I mean, I incorporated the idea, but to hear him say it, he says, "It is disturbing to witness a globalization that exacerbates the condition of the needy, that does not sufficiently contribute to resolving situations of hunger, poverty, and social inequality, that fails to safeguard the natural environment. These aspects of globalization," and this is so important, so telling. He said this in 2003, by the way, "can give rise to extreme reactions leading to excessive nationalism, religious fanaticism, and even acts of terrorism." That's the Pope in 2003. So, I mean, I would go back to, globalization, whatever else you say, even if you don't like the word, we're more connected than we ever were before. That's what everyone agrees on. We're more connected. It's obvious. And what do you do with that? It's a fact. It's like electricity. It exists. Now, what are you going to do about it? And what a lot of people would say, the liberation theologians, again, are, really negate it. We're worse off. That's their point. African liberation theologians say, we're worse off because of what's going on. It's great for Singapore and Hong Kong and China, but it's hurting us. So that we have to hear that voice. And you notice how he got the environmental side in there too, the natural world, the question of pollution and so on. So it's a given in our world. It has, I think, fundamentally an ambivalence. That is, it does something good and something bad. It's helpful to name what it does good. So it's clearly lifted the economies of the Asian countries. In that free trade, they benefit from it. I remember Marcy Kaptur being so against NAFTA, and where largely the business world was favoring that. Marcy said that that's going to hurt us, going to hurt the jobs especially in our area. That freer trade. It's a very ambivalent reality, and it's hard to sort out, and you're going to get differences of opinion on a lot. But the fundamental thing that you have to critique it from a Christian perspective is part of what it's about. It's, my saying is always, the cross is judge of the flag. The gospel is judge of globalization for Christian people. It isn't like, well, with globalization, good, how are we going to just go along with it? The gospel's judge of globalization. And I think when it does that, when you look at it, you see some good things. I mean, you can educate all kind of people today through the internet who can't get to schools or, wouldn't have access to libraries. I mean, it's amazing what can be done. I don't think you can just shuck that off and say, well, it's all part of some negative system. It's helped some economically, it's helped some culturally. And there's another aspect of that is that very often when we export our culture, it's actually received in a different way. I think it's the Chinese who take our Coca-Cola and put something else in it for their people. I think that that's what they do. And it's a question, how do they see Western movies with violence in them and so on? How does the Islamic world see that? It was a big part of Osama bin Laden's problem. The pornography, the violence, and so on, right in the Holy Land of Saudi Arabia. So it's fundamentally ambivalent, and you have to sort it out, and you're going to get different opinions, I think, on both vectors, the positive and the negative.